The debriefing room at Wellington Barracks felt smaller than usual as James Mitchell sat across from Colonel Richardson and Sergeant Major Davies. The formal atmosphere was thick with the weight of military protocol and the unprecedented nature of the situation they were addressing. Outside the window, London continued its normal rhythm, unaware that inside this room, the future of a soldier's career hung in the balance. Colonel Richardson had spent the past hour reviewing witness statements, media footage, and medical reports from the hospital where Emma Thompson was recovering. The evidence was overwhelming and consistent. James's actions had indeed saved a child's life, but they had also violated every protocol governing ceremonial duties. In 30 years of service, the colonel began, his voice measured and controlled, I have never faced a situation quite like this one. The regulations are clear about maintaining formation during royal ceremonies. The consequences for breaking those regulations are equally clear. James sat at rigid attention, his ceremonial uniform now replaced with standard service dress. He had prepared himself for court-martial, dismissal from service, and the end of the military career that had defined his adult life. Yet, when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Emma's frightened face and the desperate sign for help that had reached across the crowd to find him. The media response had been immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the incident, video footage had spread across social platforms worldwide, showing a Queen's Guard breaking formation to help a seizing child. News outlets from dozens of countries had picked up the story, with headlines ranging from British hero breaks ranks to save girl to when duty means breaking the rules. Sergeant Major Davies cleared his throat, drawing attention to the tablet in front of him displaying social media metrics. Sir, we've received over 50,000 messages of support through official channels. The Prime Minister's office has called twice. The Palace has issued a statement requesting a full report. The Palace statement had been particularly significant. Rather than expressing concern about protocol violations, it had praised the quick thinking and courage displayed by members of our armed forces. The carefully worded release suggested that the highest levels of government viewed James's actions favorably, despite their technical violation of regulations. Emma Thompson's condition had stabilized completely at St. Thomas Hospital. Doctors confirmed that without immediate intervention, her seizure could have resulted in permanent brain damage or death. Her mother had given numerous interviews to news outlets, consistently praising the guardian angel in a red coat who had saved her daughter's life. The medical team's report had been particularly damning in its implications about Emma's condition. She had suffered from a rare form of epilepsy that typically required constant medication to prevent life-threatening seizures. Her decision to stop taking her pills had created exactly the scenario that James had encountered, a medical emergency that could prove fatal without immediate expert intervention. Dr. Michael Harrison, the neurologist who had treated Emma, had been interviewed by BBC News about the incident. The guard's actions were not just heroic but medically sound, he had stated. His quick recognition of the seizure symptoms and appropriate emergency response quite literally saved this child's life. Any delay would have resulted in significant brain damage or worse. Colonel Richardson leaned back in his chair, clearly wrestling with the competing demands of military discipline and public relations reality. The regiment's reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by James's actions, but precedent was crucial in military justice. How this case was handled would influence future decisions by guards facing similar impossible choices. The technical violations are clear, he continued. Breaking formation, abandoning post, disrupting a royal ceremony, any one of these would normally result in disciplinary action. However, the circumstances are extraordinary, and the outcome speaks to the highest traditions of military service. James felt a flicker of hope but maintained his rigid posture. Military justice could be unpredictable, and he had learned not to assume anything until formal decisions were announced. The weeks following his action had been filled with uncertainty as various levels of command weighed their response. A knock at the door interrupted the proceedings. An aide entered and whispered something to Colonel Richardson, whose eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. The brief conversation concluded with a nod, and the aide departed, leaving the three men alone again. It appears, the colonel said slowly, that this matter has attracted attention from the highest levels of our chain of command. I have just received word that Her Majesty herself has requested a personal audience with Guard Mitchell. The implications of royal attention were staggering. In the modern era, direct royal intervention in military disciplinary matters was virtually unprecedented. The fact that the Queen herself wished to address the situation suggested that James's actions had resonated at the very top of the institution he served. Sergeant Major Davies straightened in his chair, clearly surprised by this development. Royal audiences were typically granted for acts of exceptional valor in combat or distinguished service over many years. For a ceremonial guard to receive such attention was extraordinary. However, Colonel Richardson continued, "Before that meeting occurs, this command must reach its own conclusions about your actions, Mitchell. Military discipline cannot be subject to popular opinion or media attention, regardless of how positive that attention might be." James nodded, understanding the principle at stake. If military personnel could break regulations whenever they judged the circumstances warranted it, the entire structure of discipline and order would collapse. Yet, he also understood that sometimes higher principles demanded exactly such choices. The room fell silent as Colonel Richardson reviewed his notes one final time. The decision he was about to announce would not only determine James's future but would establish precedent for how the military balanced rigid protocol against human compassion in extreme circumstances. "Guard Mitchell," the colonel said formally, "your actions on the day in question violated multiple regulations governing ceremonial duties. You broke formation, abandoned your post, and disrupted a royal ceremony watched by millions of people worldwide." James felt his heart sink as the formal recitation of his violations continued. Each word seemed to drive another nail into the coffin of his military career. However, the colonel continued, "Your actions also demonstrated the highest values of military service, protection of the innocent, quick thinking under pressure, and placing duty to humanity above personal consequences. Medical experts have confirmed that your intervention prevented serious injury or death to a 7-year-old child." The pause that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity as James waited for the final verdict. "Therefore, this command finds that your actions, while technically in violation of ceremonial protocol, were justified by extraordinary circumstances and consistent with the highest traditions of military service. No disciplinary action will be taken. Furthermore, I am recommending you for commendation for your quick thinking and life-saving actions." Relief flooded through James so powerfully that he struggled to maintain his military bearing. Not only would his career survive, but his actions were being officially recognized as worthy of praise rather than punishment. 2 weeks later, James found himself in an ornate drawing room at Buckingham Palace, wearing his finest dress uniform and preparing to meet the woman whose guard he had abandoned to help a stranger. The irony was not lost on him, he was being honored by the very institution whose protocol he had violated. The Queen entered the room with her characteristic calm dignity, her presence commanding immediate attention despite her modest stature. James snapped to attention, every detail of royal protocol flooding back through his training. "At ease, Guard Mitchell," she said with a slight smile. "I believe we have something rather extraordinary to discuss." The conversation that followed would remain private, as was appropriate for royal audiences, but when James emerged 30 minutes later, his expression suggested that the meeting had exceeded his highest expectations. The Queen's personal recognition of his actions represented the ultimate validation that duty sometimes required breaking rules in service of higher principles. 6 months later, Emma Thompson attended the Queen's birthday parade, healthy and seizure-free thanks to new medication and careful monitoring. She sat in a place of honor, having been personally invited to observe the ceremony she had disrupted. Beside her sat her mother, no longer focused on photography but instead watching her daughter's face light up with joy at the spectacle. James Mitchell marched in perfect formation with his unit, his record now enhanced rather than damaged by his moment of decision. On his uniform, he wore a new decoration, the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct, recognizing his life-saving actions on that extraordinary day. As the guards passed Emma's position in the crowd, James allowed himself the slightest deviation from protocol, a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement toward the little girl whose courage in asking for help had changed both their lives. Emma waved enthusiastically, her gesture no longer one of desperation but of joy and gratitude. The moment reminded everyone present that behind the pageantry and tradition, the uniform represented something more fundamental, a promise to protect those who needed help, regardless of the personal cost. Sometimes, the greatest honor came not from following orders, but from recognizing when humanity demanded a higher response. The parade continued in perfect formation, but everyone who knew the story understood they were witnessing something deeper than ceremony. They were seeing the living embodiment of values that made uniforms meaningful: courage, compassion, and the wisdom to know when duty required breaking the rules to serve a greater good. The sound of sirens cut through the London air as emergency services responded to the unprecedented call from the Queen's Guard ceremony. James maintained his position beside Emma, monitoring her breathing and pulse while the seizure began to subside. His red ceremonial tunic was now wrinkled and disheveled from kneeling on the pavement, but his focus remained entirely on the small girl whose life hung in the balance. Sergeant Major Davies had made his way through the disrupted formation to assess the situation firsthand. What he found challenged every assumption he had held about protocol and duty. One of his guards had indeed broken formation, abandoned his post, and disrupted a royal ceremony, but he had done so to save a child's life. The sergeant major's military mind struggled to categorize this action within the framework of regulations he had enforced for 3 decades. Status report: Mitchell, Davies commanded, his voice carrying the authority of rank despite the chaos surrounding them. 7-year-old female, grand mal seizure, approximately 4 minutes duration, James replied without looking up from Emma, his military medical training providing the precise language needed. Breathing stabilized, pulse strong, seizure activity decreasing. Ambulance en route. The crowd that had gathered around them represented a cross-section of London society: tourists from dozens of countries, local families, elderly veterans, and curious onlookers who had been drawn by the commotion. Many were recording the scene on their phones, creating a documentary record that would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. Emma's breathing gradually returned to normal as the seizure reached its conclusion. Her small body relaxed in the wheelchair, and color began returning to her lips. James continued monitoring her vital signs while speaking in gentle, reassuring tones that seemed completely at odds with his imposing military appearance. "You're going to be all right, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice carrying the same authority he had used to command the crowd's attention, but now tempered with genuine warmth. "The doctors are coming to make sure you're completely okay." Susan Thompson knelt beside her daughter, holding Emma's hand and struggling to process the rapid sequence of events. Minutes earlier, she had been absorbed in photography, planning the perfect family album. Now she faced the reality that her daughter had nearly died while she stood just feet away, and only the quick action of a stranger had prevented tragedy. The London Ambulance Service paramedics arrived with remarkable speed, their vehicle navigating through the crowd that had gathered along the parade route. The sight of emergency personnel in their high-visibility uniforms created in stark contrast with the ceremonial soldiers, highlighting the collision between planned pageantry and unpredictable human need. James provided a detailed handoff to the paramedics, describing Emma's condition and the duration of the seizure with medical precision that surprised the emergency responders. Most civilians, even those with basic first aid training, struggled to provide such clear and useful information during crisis situations. "Military medic training?" asked Sarah Williams, the lead paramedic, as she took over Emma's care. "Combat medical technician course, plus emergency response certification," James confirmed. She stopped breathing for approximately 30 seconds during the worst of it, but airway remained clear throughout. The paramedics worked efficiently to stabilize Emma for transport, checking her vital signs and preparing her for the journey to nearby St. Thomas Hospital. Their professional assessment confirmed James's initial diagnosis: Emma had indeed suffered a serious seizure that could have resulted in permanent injury or death without intervention. While medical personnel attended to Emma, the broader implications of James's actions began to ripple outward. Television news crews that had been covering the ceremony found themselves documenting a very different story. The planned coverage of royal pageantry had transformed into breaking news about heroism and human compassion. Colonel Richardson, overall commander of the Guard ceremony, arrived at the scene as Emma was being loaded into the ambulance. His expression was unreadable as he surveyed the disrupted formation, the crowd of onlookers, and the Guard who had created this unprecedented situation. Years of military experience had not prepared him for this particular scenario. The other Guards remained in formation, though their perfect alignment had been irretrievably compromised by James's absence. Some displayed subtle signs of support for their colleagues' actions, barely perceptible nods, slight shifts in posture that spoke volumes to those trained to read military bearing. Others maintained rigid discipline, uncertain how to process what they had witnessed. Emma's condition stabilized completely as the ambulance prepared to depart. Her eyes opened, and she looked around with the confusion typical of post-seizure recovery. When her gaze fell on James, still kneeling beside her stretcher in his distinctive red uniform, she managed a small smile that made every regulation he had broken seem worthwhile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd noise. Susan Thompson approached James as the ambulance doors closed, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I was right there, and I didn't even notice. You saved her life." The weight of what had occurred was beginning to settle on James as he watched the ambulance navigate through the crowd toward the hospital. He had broken the most fundamental rule of ceremonial duty, disrupted a royal event being watched by millions worldwide, and potentially ended his military career. Yet, looking at the faces around him, the relief of Emma's mother, the approval in many spectators' eyes, the grudging respect from his fellow guards, he felt no regret. Colonel Richardson's approach commanded attention from the surrounding crowd. His uniform bore the insignia of decades of distinguished service, and his reputation for unwavering discipline was legendary throughout the regiment. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Guard Mitchell," he said formally, "you will accompany me for immediate debriefing." The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness the consequences of James's unprecedented action. Many had their cameras ready, understanding that whatever happened next would become part of the historical record of this extraordinary day. James rose to his full height and came to attention, his ceremonial uniform bearing the wrinkles and dust of his emergency response efforts. His expression remained composed, but those watching closely could see the tension in his shoulders as he prepared to face the judgment of his commanding officers. "Sir, yes sir," he replied, his voice carrying the crisp clarity of military precision. But, before the formal proceedings could begin, something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a slow clap began. It started with an elderly man wearing the distinctive beret of a Royal Marine veteran, who had recognized the courage required to break formation in service of a higher duty. The applause spread rapidly through the crowd as more spectators joined in, creating a wave of appreciation that encompassed hundreds of people. Tourists who had traveled thousands of miles to witness British pageantry found themselves witnessing something far more meaningful, a demonstration of the values that uniform truly represented. The sound of applause mixed with the fading sirens of the ambulance carrying Emma to safety, creating a soundtrack for a moment that would be remembered long after the details of the original ceremony had faded from memory. James stood at attention, surrounded by the approval of strangers and the uncertain judgment of his superiors, knowing that whatever consequences followed, he had chosen correctly when it mattered most. The collision between protocol and humanity had produced a clear winner, even if the institutional response remained to be determined. The weight of decision pressed down on James Mitchell like a physical force as he continued marching in perfect formation. 3 years of exemplary service, countless hours of training, and an unblemished record all hung in the balance of the next few seconds. Behind him, he could hear the measured footsteps of his fellow guards, each man trusting that the formation would remain intact. Emma's seizure was worsening rapidly. Her small body jerked violently in the wheelchair, and foam began to appear at the corners of her mouth. The sign for help that she had struggled to maintain was now impossible as her arms convulsed uncontrollably. Her eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and her breathing became labored and irregular. Still, her mother remained focused on her camera, adjusting settings to capture the approaching guards in perfect lighting. Susan Thompson had spent considerable money on professional photography equipment for this trip, determined to create lasting memories of what she hoped would be a special bonding experience with her daughter. The irony was cruel. In her effort to preserve the moment, she was missing the emergency that was unfolding right beside her. James had perhaps 10 seconds before the formation would carry him past the girl's position. Once they moved beyond her location, any chance of helping would be lost. The crowd was thick with people, and medical personnel were positioned far from this particular section. If Emma was going to receive help, it would have to come from someone who could see her right now. The other spectators nearest to Emma were elderly tourists from Japan who spoke little English and were unfamiliar with seizure symptoms. They had noticed the girl's movement but assumed it was excitement about the parade. A family with young children stood to Emma's left, but they were completely absorbed in keeping their own kids corralled and entertained. The perfect storm of circumstances had created a situation where a medical emergency was occurring in plain sight of hundreds of people, yet no one was responding. Sergeant Major Davies, marching at the head of the formation, maintained his focus on the route ahead. The ceremony was proceeding exactly as planned, with timing perfect and formation intact. From his perspective, everything was going smoothly. He had no way of knowing that one of his guards was about to make a decision that would challenge every protocol he had spent his career enforcing. James felt his heart pounding against his ribs as he approached the moment of truth. The military bearing that had been drilled into him for years was at war with basic human compassion. He thought of his own sister Sarah, somewhere in this crowd, and how he would feel if she were in distress while uniformed soldiers marched past without stopping to help. The crowd's attention was completely focused on the approaching guards, creating a cacophony of camera clicks and excited voices. Children called out questions about the tall black hats and bright red uniforms. Adults explained the ceremony's significance to their companions. The normal sounds of a successful royal event masked the fact that a life-threatening emergency was developing just meters away. Emma's condition deteriorated further as the seizure reached its peak intensity. Her breathing became increasingly labored, and her color began to change from healthy pink to an alarming bluish tint around her lips. This type of seizure, without immediate medical intervention, could cause permanent brain damage or death. The medication she had stopped taking would have prevented this exact scenario, but her 7-year-old decision-making had not considered such consequences. James reached the critical point of no return. In 5 more steps, he would be past Emma's position, and the formation would continue its march toward Horse Guards Parade. The weight of military discipline pressed against his consciousness like a physical barrier, reinforced by years of conditioning that made breaking formation almost unthinkable. But then, he looked directly at Emma, and their eyes met for just a moment. Despite the seizure, despite her distress, he saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a child's hope that the uniformed figure she had been taught to respect and trust would somehow make everything right. That moment of connection shattered James's hesitation. Without warning, he broke formation. The effect was immediate and dramatic. James stepped sideways out of the perfectly aligned column, his sudden movement creating a gap that rippled through the entire formation. The guard behind him, Patterson, nearly collided with him before managing to adjust his step. The synchronized rhythm that had defined their march for the past 20 minutes was instantly disrupted. Gasps rose from the crowd as spectators realized something extraordinary was happening. This was not part of the ceremony. Guards simply did not break formation during royal events. Camera phones swung toward James as tourists tried to capture whatever was about to unfold. Medical emergency! James shouted, his voice cutting through the crowd noise with military clarity. He pushed through the spectators toward Emma, his red uniform creating a wake of confused and startled faces. Make way! Medical emergency! Susan Thompson finally looked up from her camera viewfinder at the sound of commotion behind her. What she saw made her drop the expensive equipment without a second thought. Her daughter was in the throes of a severe seizure, her small body convulsing violently while a Queen's Guard knelt beside the wheelchair, his training switching from ceremonial protocol to emergency response. James's military medical training took over as he reached Emma's side. He quickly assessed her condition, noting the blue discoloration, the violent convulsions, and the foam at her mouth. This was a grand mal seizure, serious enough to be life-threatening without immediate intervention. Someone call 999, he shouted to the crowd while simultaneously checking Emma's airway and positioning her to prevent injury from the convulsions. Now! Tell them we have a child in status epilepticus. The disruption to the ceremony was total. The entire formation had ground to a halt as guards struggled to understand what was happening. Sergeant Major Davies, hearing the commotion behind him, turned to see one of his guards kneeling in the crowd, completely abandoning his position. For a moment, Davies felt his career flash before his eyes. This was unprecedented, career-ending, and absolutely inexcusable. But then, he heard James's medical assessment being shouted to the gathering crowd, and Davies realized this was not a breakdown of discipline, it was an act of heroism in progress. The crowd around Emma parted as James worked to stabilize her condition. His bright red uniform made him impossible to miss, and his commanding voice cut through the confusion to coordinate the emergency response. Years of military medical training had prepared him for exactly this type of crisis, though he had never imagined using those skills while wearing full ceremonial dress. Television cameras that had been following the parade swung toward the unfolding drama, broadcasting the unprecedented scene to millions of viewers worldwide. This was not the ceremony that organizers had planned, but it was rapidly becoming something far more meaningful, a demonstration of the values that the uniform truly represented. Emma's mother reached her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face as she realized how close she had come to losing her child while standing just inches away. The professional photographs she had planned seemed utterly meaningless now compared to the reality of her daughter's medical crisis. James continued his emergency care, monitoring Emma's vital signs and maintaining her airway while shouting instructions to bystanders about calling for ambulance services. The ceremony had become secondary to the life-or-death situation unfolding before hundreds of witnesses, and everyone present understood they were seeing something extraordinary, a moment when human compassion trumped institutional protocol. The ripple effects of James's decision were spreading far beyond the immediate medical emergency, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge traditions, redefine heroism, and ultimately change how the world viewed the meaning of duty. The command came sharp and clear across the parade ground: "Guards, attention!" James's body responded instantly, muscles snapping to perfect alignment as 300 men became a single, unified force. The morning's preparation was over, the ceremony had begun. Emma Thompson watched from her position near the front of the crowd, her wheelchair positioned carefully by her mother to give her the best possible view. At 7 years old, she possessed the keen observation skills that often surprised adults, noticing details that others missed. Today, those skills would prove more important than anyone could imagine. She had been excited about this day for weeks, ever since her teacher Mrs. Henderson had taught their class about the Queen's Guards and the important work they did protecting the royal family. The lesson had included something special, a demonstration of British Sign Language, which Mrs. Henderson explained was used by people who could not hear or speak. Emma had practiced the signs at home, fascinated by this silent form of communication. But Emma had not come to the ceremony just to watch. Hidden beneath her blanket was a secret that her mother did not know. Emma had stopped taking her medication 3 days ago. The pills that controlled her seizures made her feel foggy and strange, and she had convinced herself she was getting better. She wanted to feel normal for once, to experience the excitement of the parade without the dulling effect of her medicine. As the guards began their march, James felt the familiar rhythm take hold of his body. Left, right, each step perfectly timed, each movement synchronized with the men around him. The crowd fell silent as the spectacle began, hundreds of tourists raising cameras and phones to capture the moment. The route took them past cheering spectators, past buildings draped with Union Jack bunting, past police officers who nodded respectfully as the column passed. James kept his eyes fixed ahead, but his peripheral vision caught glimpses of the crowd's reactions: children pointing excitedly, elderly veterans saluting respectfully, tourists fumbling with cameras to capture the perfect shot. Emma watched intently as the guards approached her section of the crowd. She could see their faces beneath their tall black hats, noting how young some of them looked. One guard in particular caught her attention. He had kind eyes and a gentle expression despite his stern military bearing. Something about him reminded her of her older brother Tom, who always made her feel safe when she was scared. The first signs of trouble began subtly. Emma's vision started to blur slightly around the edges, a sensation she recognized but had hoped to avoid. Her left hand began to tremble, almost imperceptibly at first, then, with increasing intensity. The medication she had stopped taking was designed to prevent exactly this scenario, but Emma's 7-year-old logic had convinced her she no longer needed it. James maintained his perfect posture as they passed the first checkpoint. The ceremony was proceeding flawlessly, each element clicking into place with mechanical precision. The crowd's enthusiastic response was exactly what they had expected. This was why people traveled from around the world to see the guards, to witness living history in motion. But something was beginning to feel wrong to James, though he could not identify what. Years of training had sharpened his instincts beyond the normal range of civilian awareness. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the ceremony, a subtle wrongness that his subconscious mind detected even while his conscious thoughts remained focused on the march. Emma's mother, Susan Thompson, was completely absorbed in taking photographs, her expensive camera clicking rapidly as she tried to capture the perfect shot to commemorate their special day out. She had planned this trip for months, saving money to bring Emma to see something magical and uplifting. Susan was so focused on the viewfinder that she did not notice her daughter's increasing distress. The trembling in Emma's hand was spreading up her arm now, and she could feel the familiar warning signs that preceded her worst seizures. Panic began to set in as she realized how serious this was becoming. Her mother was standing behind her, turned away to get a better camera angle, completely unaware of the medical emergency developing just feet away. James was halfway through the route when his peripheral vision caught something that made his trained instincts flare into high alert. A small movement in the crowd, different from the excited waving and pointing of the other spectators. His eyes remained locked forward according to protocol, but his awareness sharpened dramatically. Emma knew she needed help immediately. The seizure was building in intensity, and she could feel herself losing control of her motor functions. In desperation, she remembered the sign language Mrs. Henderson had taught them, specifically, the sign for help. With tremendous effort, she raised her shaking hands and formed the sign, holding it as steadily as she could manage. The sign was subtle, easy to miss among the crowd of waving hands and raised cameras. But Emma held it in place, hoping against hope that someone would see and understand. Her young mind focused entirely on this one desperate attempt to communicate her need for immediate medical assistance. James felt rather than saw the urgency in his peripheral vision. Something was wrong in the crowd, something that demanded attention despite the absolute prohibition against breaking formation. His training had prepared him to identify threats, but this felt different, not dangerous to the ceremony, but dangerous to someone in the crowd. Years of military discipline warred with basic human instincts as James continued marching. The rigid protocols were clear: maintain formation, eyes forward, no acknowledgement of spectators under any circumstances. Breaking these rules during a royal ceremony was a career-ending offense that could result in court-martial and disgrace. But, somewhere in the crowd, a child was in trouble. Emma's seizure was intensifying, her small body beginning to convulse in the wheelchair despite her desperate attempts to maintain control. The sign language gesture for help was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as her muscles spasmed uncontrollably. Tears of frustration and fear began streaming down her face as she realized her mother still had not noticed. The other spectators around Emma were too focused on the approaching guards to notice the medical emergency developing in their midst. The excitement of the ceremony had created a tunnel vision effect, where everyone was looking at the parade instead of paying attention to their immediate surroundings. James made a decision that would haunt or define him for the rest of his career. Despite every regulation, despite years of training that demanded absolute obedience to protocol, he shifted his gaze slightly toward the source of his unease. What he saw made his heart stop. A little girl in a wheelchair was holding up the sign for help, her small hands shaking violently as what appeared to be a seizure overtook her small body. Her mother stood behind her, completely oblivious, still taking photographs of the approaching guards. The child's distress was obvious to James, but invisible to everyone else around her. The moment stretched into eternity as James faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Everything he had been taught demanded that he maintain formation and continue marching. But everything he believed about duty and protection screamed that he must act to help this child. Time seemed to slow as James weighed his options, knowing that his next choice would determine not only his future but possibly the life of the frightened little girl whose desperate sign for help had somehow reached him across the crowd. The morning air carried a crisp bite that made Guard James Mitchell's breath visible as he stood at attention outside Wellington Barracks. His scarlet tunic, pristine and pressed to perfection, bore the weight of 3 years of impeccable service to the crown. At 25, he had earned his position through dedication that bordered on obsession, memorizing every protocol, every movement, every possible scenario that might occur during a royal ceremony. Today marked the Queen's annual inspection of the guards, a tradition stretching back centuries. Thousands of spectators would line the streets of London, their cameras ready to capture the pageantry that made Britain famous worldwide. James had participated in dozens of such ceremonies, but this one felt different. Perhaps it was the unusual number of security briefings they had received, or the way his commanding officer's eyes lingered a moment longer during the morning inspection. The other guards moved with mechanical precision around him, their movements synchronized through countless hours of practice. Each man knew his role perfectly: when to march, when to halt, when to present arms. Their tall bearskin hats created an imposing silhouette against the London skyline, a living symbol of British tradition and military excellence. James adjusted his grip on his rifle, feeling the familiar weight that had become as natural as breathing. His mind wandered briefly to his younger sister Sarah, who would be watching from the crowd somewhere along the parade route. She had begged their parents to bring her, fascinated by the spectacle of her brother's ceremonial duties. The thought of her proud face in the crowd brought a small smile to his lips, quickly suppressed as Sergeant Major Davies approached for final inspection. "Right then, lads," Davies barked, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in the Guards. "Today we show the world what British precision looks like. No breaking formation, no acknowledgement of the crowd, eyes forward at all times. The Queen herself will be watching, along with millions on television worldwide. Remember, you are not just soldiers today, you are living symbols of our nation's heritage." The speech was familiar, yet Davies delivered it with particular intensity. James noticed the slight tremor in the older man's hands, a sign of nerves that surprised him. Davies had served through conflicts and ceremonies that made today seem routine, yet something was clearly weighing on his mind. As they marched toward the assembly point, James caught glimpses of the gathering crowd. Families had arrived hours early to secure prime viewing spots, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, Union Jack flags waving in the morning breeze. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement and anticipation, a stark contrast to the solemn discipline of the Guards preparing for their performance. The route would take them past Buckingham Palace, down the Mall, and through Horse Guards Parade before returning to barracks. Every step was mapped, every timing calculated to ensure the ceremony proceeded without flaw. James had walked this route in practice so many times he could do it blindfolded, yet today felt charged with unusual significance. Near the starting position, he noticed increased police presence. Officers with discreet earpieces moved through the crowd, their eyes scanning faces with professional intensity. A helicopter circled overhead, its rhythmic beats barely audible above the growing murmur of spectators. Something was different about today's security arrangements, though the Guards had been told only to maintain their usual vigilance. James's training kicked in automatically as they formed ranks. His posture became impossibly straight, his expression neutral, his focus laser-sharp on the task ahead. Years of drill had programmed these responses so deeply they required no conscious thought. He was no longer just James Mitchell, son and brother, he was Guard Mitchell, defender of the crown, upholder of tradition. The crowd continued to swell as morning progressed into late morning. James could hear the excited chatter of tourists mixing with the more subdued conversations of locals who had witnessed these ceremonies many times before. Children's voices carried clearly on the air, their questions about the soldiers' tall hats and bright uniforms answered patiently by parents and grandparents. A brass band began warming up nearby, their practice notes creating a cheerful soundtrack to the pre-ceremony preparations. The familiar tunes of military marches drifted across the assembly area, stirring something deep in James's chest. These were the songs of his heritage, melodies that had inspired British soldiers for generations. Today, he would march to these same rhythms, carrying forward a tradition that connected him to countless brave men who had worn the same uniform. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the parade ground. James felt sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy uniform, but his training allowed him to ignore such discomforts. Physical endurance was just another aspect of the job, no different from maintaining perfect posture or keeping his rifle at precisely the correct angle. Around him, his fellow guards maintained their own perfect discipline. Johnson, the newest member of their unit, stood with particular rigidity, his nervousness visible only to those who knew what to look for. Williams, a veteran of 5 years, appeared completely relaxed despite his military bearing. Patterson, standing to James's left, had the focused expression of a man running through the ceremony's choreography in his mind. The crowd noise was growing louder now, building toward the excitement that would peak when the ceremony began. James could distinguish individual voices, a mother calling to her wandering child, an elderly man explaining the history of the Guards to his granddaughter, a group of American tourists marveling at the pageantry they had traveled thousands of miles to witness. Somewhere in that crowd, people were preparing to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about royal protocol and military discipline. Among the spectators, a 7-year-old girl named Emma Thompson was fidgeting in her wheelchair, her small hands practicing a gesture she had learned in school, a gesture that would soon change the course of the entire ceremony. But, for now, guard James Mitchell stood at perfect attention, unaware that in less than an hour, his training, his instincts, and his humanity would be put to a test unlike anything the manual had prepared him for. The morning sun continued its climb across the London sky, and the great machine of ceremony prepared to begin its ancient, precise dance through the streets of the capital. The moment that would define his career, and possibly save a life, was approaching with the inevitability of the turning Earth itself. In a world where protocol rules everything and a single mistake can end careers, sometimes the most powerful messages are delivered without words. What happens when a 7-year-old girl's desperate silent plea reaches the one person trained never to break formation? This is the true story of how a child's courage and a guard's humanity changed everything in just 60 seconds, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. When royal ceremonies unfold, every movement is choreographed, every step planned, every eye forward. But, on one extraordinary day in London, a little girl's secret hand signal would stop an entire parade and reveal that true heroism often comes in the quietest moments. This is not just a story about breaking rules, it's about the moment when human compassion overcame rigid tradition, and how one guard's decision to act saved a life while the whole world watched.